Good morning, everybody, on a beautiful Friday morning. Thanks so much for joining us for this important topic. And on behalf of myself and more importantly, my 700-plus Liberty Bank teammates, we want to welcome everybody for here this morning. And once again, thank you for attending. We're excited to host this. This is the second annual Economic Development Symposium titled Housing Matters. It's about breaking down barriers and dismantling the disparities. Joined once again by our keynote speaker, David Erickson of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and we're also pleased to be joined by Dana Peterson, the chief economist of the Conference Board. As we were getting ready for this virtual event, I had a chance to introduce myself to Dana and welcome her back to Middletown virtually, if nonetheless, as you will see in both David and Dana's incredibly impressive backgrounds. Dana did her undergraduate degree right here next door to our neighbor and good friend Wesleyan University. So I want to welcome and thank both David and Dana for joining us on this important topic of access to safe and affordable housing. We all know the importance of that, and it really does allow these families to achieve the gains that they need that they're not getting. It's not just about a roof over their head, but that level of security and affordable quality housing really allows these families to make the advances they need in education and employment and economically. So it's unquestionably such an important topic now more than ever. In these challenging times. There's been a lot done in this area, but I think all of us, regardless of the communities we live in, just need to look around and realize how much more we all need to do. We all have to do, and we have an obligation to do it. Is a community bank, Liberty Bank is Connecticut's oldest bank. We've been around for 195 years and have always focused on our communities and providing the support. And we're uniquely positioned as a community bank to do that. And we're obligated, and we should be obligated to do that as a lender, as an educator, as a funder, in doing things like this from an educational standpoint, sponsoring important events like this where we can hear from national industry experts and get their views on things that we can, from a partnership standpoint, partner with all of you that are out there today and other critical centers of influence in our communities to make the advances here in our affordable housing communities that we need to. So once again, thank you for joining us. I think we have a great program ahead, and I hope everybody really finds it very informative and enjoyable, and we can all walk away with the right type of takeaways to partner and continue to partner and look for those synergies where in affordable housing we can, together make that formula of 1 + 1 = 3, because we really can and we really need to do that now more than ever. So now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to my good friend and my teammate, Glenn Davis. Glenn is our Community Development and CRA Officer, and Glenn's going to share a little bit more about this morning's virtual program and our two just terrific speakers we're so blessed to have with us today. So, Glenn?
David, thank you, and good morning to our distinguished panelists and to all those that have joined this symposium. Last year, this time when we had the symposium, David Erickson reminded us it was snowing outside. And so we've come full circle. This is a different experience this year. This is a complete virtual experience. While I would certainly love for all of us to be together, this is, again, much better than the snow. And I'm really excited to have these two dynamic individuals. David was with us last year, and great to have Dana. Both of them bring a tremendous body of work relative to talking about housing and disparities and racial equity. And so we're really excited to listen to what they have to talk about. And it's no secret that when we speak about affordable housing, how housing itself is really a critical platform to help families and individuals achieve all the other components in their lives, to have better housing, to have better health, better education. And so affordable housing is a great platform. I'm excited to hear about Dana. She brings a tremendous body of work from an economist perspective. And so she's done a tremendous amount of work around analyzing global themes. But more importantly, one of the things that Dana has done is she really participated. She co-authored a significant research report while she was at Citicorp, really talking about closing the racial gaps. And they really looked at it from an economic perspective. And I think, so I'm really excited to hear what she's going to bring to the table today. She talks about closing those gaps. And again, with David, David is with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Glad to have him. I really appreciate, David, your perspective today because it's at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time, and David happens to be on the West Coast. So we know that we're really interested in this discussion. David is committed to this discussion by virtue of getting up so early. So thank you so much. And David is going to talk about really guardrails and airbags. And so today's discussion is really about, looking at it from a very pragmatic perspective, from Dana's perspective, but also really getting to the nuts and bolts of how we can make some systemic change to really move the needle and move the narrative from conversation to action. And so without further ado, I am just so pleased, as David Glidden mentioned, Dana is a Wesleyan graduate, but she also has a master's in economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she is just, her full body of work includes just economic study and monetary policy. But what she brings to the table is also a real understanding about the work that we're talking about. And so she's now with the conference board. And so without further ado, I just really want to turn to you, Dana, and say welcome and thank you. And we look forward to sharing in your discussion.
Thank you so much, Glenn, and thanks for the great introduction. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for having me. The pandemic exposed and exacerbated pre-existing racial economic gaps. And closing those gaps indeed has a moral imperative, as David said earlier, and as Glenn also said. But what about the economic argument for doing so? So what we did while I was still, I'm at the conference board for 2 months now, but I was at Citigroup when I wrote this report, is we thought about quantifying racial economic gaps. And so we said to ourselves, well, what have we seen over the last 20 years? And a lot of that was dependent upon the data. And we estimated that racial gaps, in particular the gap between Black households and white households, has cost the U.S. economy about $16 trillion over the last 2 decades. And that is just really astounding. Roughly $13 trillion of that is related to lost revenues, or revenues that were never accrued by businesses due to lack of access to capital and credit. But this discussion today is really about housing and the consumer. And we noticed that that due to these racial gaps, we've had 770,000 fewer Black homeowners over the last 20 years. And what does that mean? That means that there has been a significant amount of spending that hasn't been done in terms of purchasing homes, and then also spending associated with filling the home with things like furniture and appliances and cars. And so there's significant economic costs to these gaps. And I think looking at this in terms of dollars and cents really does help people to understand the cost, but also thinking about the benefits. So we thought about, well, what would happen if we closed all these gaps? What kind of growth would we see over the next 5 years? And some of that was dependent upon a model that we used. We took those gaps and we put them into the model and said, what would we get if we close them? And indeed, we could potentially add roughly $5 trillion to U.S. GDP by 2025 by closing the racial gaps between Black families and white families. And indeed, that adds roughly 0.4 to GDP per year. And that's really astounding when we think about how weak the economy has been amid the pandemic and the potential glacial pace of recovery post-pandemic. If we could add 0.4 to GDP growth every year just from getting rid of these racial gaps, I think that's just truly, truly astounding. So just thinking about the gaps themselves, I'm going to focus mainly on the racial housing gap today. So, I mean, many of these graphs are going to look very familiar to all of you, but certainly when we look at the homeownership rate among Black families, it is persistently below that of all other families in the United States. And indeed, homeownership rates have ticked up this year, and a lot of that's a function of the fact that interest rates are at bargain basement lows due to the fact that the Fed's been extremely accommodative amid the pandemic, and also because there was pent-up demand for housing. And we're also seeing that many people are moving out of cities and into rural and suburban and exurban areas amid the pandemic, looking for more space. But nonetheless, we're still seeing that for Black homeowners, the rate is still well below just about everyone else. And so why is this significant? Well, when we think about wealth, housing is usually the one item of wealth that most families have. A few families actually own stocks or bonds, but most families own a house, and that house is certainly the biggest chunk in terms of overall wealth that most families have. But if we take a look at this chart on the right-hand side, we notice that among non-financial assets, housing, again, yes, is a huge chunk, but Black families have the least in terms of housing wealth. And so why is that important? Well, when we think about what's happening here, Black families are missing out on home price appreciation. And a lot of this is actually historical. If we go back more than 100 years, well, or even roughly 100 years, there were policies put in place, both by governments, entities such as insurers and also realtors, as well as individuals, prevented many Black people from becoming homeowners. And even when they did, it meant that those homes were in depressed areas due to redlining. And so many Black homeowners have not, many Black persons have not been allowed to buy homes, and consequently didn't have that transfer of wealth from generation to generation through home ownership. And again, when we look at non-financial assets and holdings of primary residences, Black families are lagging other groups. Also, when we look at many Black people who have owned houses over the last decade or so, or 20 years, they've actually experienced declines in housing appreciation, or rather the value of their home. So even owning a home was not necessarily beneficial to many Black families, especially since the great financial crisis. Whereas for other homeowners, particularly white homeowners, they've actually seen home price appreciation. So why is that? Well, some of that is because Black families, even the wealthier ones, tend to live in Black neighborhoods. But again, because of decisions that were made decades ago, well over 100 years ago, many of these areas are depressed or have not seen much in the way of home price appreciation, or they're in inner cities where there's less development potentially. And so Black families are missing out on the home price appreciation that many other families are experiencing. And also Black families are missing out on tax benefits associated with owning a home. And indeed, when we look across nations, the U.S. actually does have a benefit from mortgage interest deduction and also from tax cuts, tax breaks and credits that you can receive at the state and local level from owning a home. And so one thing I mentioned was the fact that you don't have this intergenerational transfer of wealth through homeownership. And that's significant. Indeed, when we look at the wealth gap between Black and white families, it's roughly 8 times, where white families have close to 8 times as much wealth as Black families. And a lot of that is because of the ability to transfer wealth through inheritances from one generation to the next. And indeed, as we've already seen, housing is a big portion of this wealth that Black families are not accruing. So why is it the case that Black families are having such difficulty? I mean, again, some of it's historical. Actually, a lot of it's historical. But fast forwarding to now, many of it's due to lack of access to credit. And some of that is because many Black potential homeowners are facing loan denials. Indeed, when we look at the denial rates for mortgages, Black families experience the highest rates of denial. And that is true for not only conventional mortgages, but also non-conventional mortgages. And so why are these housing loans being denied? Well, there are a number of factors, and indeed, poor credit quality is a factor, and elevated debt-to-income ratios are also another factor here. So this is the case across different demographic groups, but it's more acute, especially for Black families. So what are some of the reasons for poor credit history? Well, some of it's due to the fact that many Black families are either underbanked or not banked at all. So many of them are using alternative alternative means of financial access, such as payday lending and renting to own and those kinds of financial services. Indeed, there's a pretty high correlation between having access to traditional banking and your credit score. Indeed, your credit score tends to be worse the more often you're using these alternative forms of banking. And also, when it comes to credit scores, a lot of it's poor credit history and elevated debt. Indeed, many families and many individuals end up ruining their credit, oftentimes in their college years. And some of that's due to lack of education, financial literacy, but also not being able to have access to traditional types of banking. Indeed, when we take a look at this map, it's a little busy, but basically what it's telling us that where you see a proliferation of alternative forms of banking, you also see that there are very large minority populations. And so potentially these alternative financial institutions are taking advantage of the fact that you have these large unbanked populations. And indeed, so that increases the imperative for traditional banking services in areas where there are very heavy minority populations. And also, when we look at debt burdens, why are debt burdens so elevated among Black persons? A lot of it's student loan burdens. And indeed, when we look at people over the course of their lifetime who have a college degree versus those who don't, typically those who have a college degree have higher lifetime earnings. But when you look at the demographics, Black people who have college degrees tend to have a lot higher debt than white people who don't have college degrees. And also the outcomes for Black people with college degrees are somehow less beneficial relative to white persons who don't have college degrees. So indeed, student loan debt is a huge and incredible burden for many families. And certainly when it comes to applying for a mortgage, if you have these outsized debt, levels of debt, especially student loan debt, it's very difficult to obtain a mortgage. And then let's not forget about affordable housing. It's incredibly in short supply. When we look at, unfortunately, I don't have Middletown, Connecticut here. It's probably in among these unlabeled circles here, but for the most part, what this is telling us is that in the larger metropolitan areas, there's a significant affordable housing shortage, especially in metropolitan areas that have high concentrations of African Americans and Black persons. And so this is really a very acute problem, and hence it's contributing to the fact that you don't have adequate or enough people who are benefiting from home ownership. Now, this is a study that was done that actually looked at many of these themes that I discussed in terms of whether or not someone's employed or their credit history or their age or their FICO score or whether or not they have a certain amount of income. And this basically is telling us that even after accounting for all of these facts, still 17% of the gap between Black and white homeownership rates is unexplained. And so potentially some of that 17% could be attributable to bias or other factors. And so all of these areas must be tackled. So again, if we don't address the gaps between white homeowners and Black homeowners or potential homeowners, then we're going to continue to see the fact that Black households have the least in terms of household net worth meanwhile accruing great degrees of debt as a share of their total assets. Again, a lot of that debt having to do with student loans. So what would happen if we actually address these issues and close the gap? Well, again, the research shows that we would have had, our research shows that we would have potentially had an additional 770,000 homeowners, and that would have translated into roughly $155 billion of spending on actually buying housing. While that may seem like a drop in the bucket for the overall economy, that is really a huge sum for the Black community. And indeed, when you add up things that people purchase associated with a home, you get even more potential spending, $65 billion, and that's tremendous. That's a tremendous contribution to growth. So what are some of the policies for the future? Well, the Urban Institute has spent a lot of time looking at this, and they basically came up with 5 areas that can be addressed in terms of closing these racial housing gaps. First, advancing policy solutions at the local level. That includes expanding small dollar mortgages, removing discriminatory terms in home and condo association deeds on single family units, property tax relief for low and moderate income taxpayers, and strengthening lender networks. Another is tackling housing supply constraints and affordability. That includes reforming local land use, building codes and zoning laws, federal investments in affordable housing, government-sponsored enterprise and housing and urban development collaboration with organizations working to make housing affordable. A third option is promoting an equitable and accessible housing finance system. So that means increasing visibility, access, and types of down payment assistance programs, alternative data for credit histories, and diverse sources of income for down payments. Fourth option is further outreach and counseling for renters and mortgage-ready millennials. That includes improving and expanding financial education and homeownership preparation, as well as expanding programs that automate savings for down payments. And then finally, a fifth option is focusing on sustainable homeownership and preservation. That includes strengthening post-purchase counseling, early warning displacement metrics, mitigation strategies, and interventions for homeowners at high risk for flood and disaster events. So these are some of the activities that could potentially be addressed in terms of helping to close the racial housing gap and then consequently closing the overall racial gaps in the U.S. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. A couple of questions that surfaced that really I'd like for you to address is that, you talked about the student loan debt, the student loan burden. And if you will, how do you address the student loan burden that hinders so many individuals, but specifically, millennials, but specifically has a greater impact in the communities of color around Black families? So how do you what kind of strategy can we really have to really help minimize that burden so that they can then qualify for decent and affordable housing?
Well, there are a few strategies, and actually this is quite controversial. Some folks say, well, these people took on the debt, they knew what they were doing, and they should pay it all back. Other folks are saying, well, no one anticipated having 2 extreme recessions within the span of 10 years, right? And so one option is helping people to refinance these student loan debts. Another option is relief, potentially from the federal government or from state and local governments, where some of this debt can actually be written off and giving people a fresh start. So those are extremes from let's not do anything to let's completely write off this debt. I'm sure there are lots of options in the middle, and you may need some combination of that. But certainly, the student loan debt crisis is tremendous, and it has indeed weighed on the ability of millennials and also even Gen Xers, people in their 40s and early 50s, their ability to save up enough money in order to buy homes.
Okay, great. Thank you. We actually have another comment, so for the group relative to your presentation, Dana. And slide 23, it's really many have become very interested in slide 23. So for the audience, please know that these slides, the entire slides, will be on Liberty Bank's website. So you can always look to that. Dana, for you, another question, and you talk about the recession, but and even as we look at now, where many might think that the economy is will be slowing down. But with that in mind, and understanding how the communities of color are always severely impacted during economic downturns and are slower to recover, so they're impacted greater and they come back slower. How can we build resilience in those communities so they can be further insulated, I guess, from the adverse effects of the economy?
I mean, that's a fantastic question indeed. We just had the employment report come out this morning, and even though jobless rates for everyone fell, they were still very elevated for Black and Hispanic persons. And there are a lot of different areas that we can tackle, just even starting from the top with the Federal Reserve. Indeed, the FOMC is now pursuing a policy of average inflation targeting, where that means that there's greater patience with inflation in order to allow unemployment rates to fall further. And so we know that when the overall unemployment rate falls, unemployment rates for other demographics also decline. So that's very important. Also focusing on collecting data and paying attention to those demographic metrics to make sure that, even if the overall economy looks like it's doing well, making sure that these demographic groups are also improving. There are a number of ways. In the report, we talk about a number of different actions that can be taken, both at the individual level, the corporate level, and the government level. Certainly at the government level, making sure that you have anti-discriminatory policies, especially with regard to labor. Among corporations, making sure that corporations are thinking about race when they're hiring, when they're upskilling their workforce, and also during the firing process, making sure that you don't have overrepresentation in certain demographics when it's time to let people go, and also thinking about ways to reskill and upskill labor forces. On the individual level, there are many things that can be done in terms of training and education, but also information, because many young people don't have access to information or even mentors or sponsors, people to help guide them in the decisions about what types of education they engage in, to make sure that they don't wind up in sectors that are very low wage types of sectors. So there are a number of areas, and there's no silver bullet here, and we're all going to have to address these things together.
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much. And again, you referenced kind of the unbanked sector, and so really a question comes around that is that what are some strategies that you would recommend that could help those who are unbanked really move into the traditional mainstream banking?
Sure. Well, one thing is making sure that traditional banks actually have a presence in minority communities. I think about where I live. I live right next door to Newark, and the bank that I bank at, there's only one branch in all of the county. So even for me, a person who is not unbanked, it's very difficult to bank. So if you don't have banks, especially, community banks are fantastic in the community, then it's very difficult for people to be banked. And also making sure that for those who do have access to banks, that there's no differentiation in terms of fees and how much money people must keep on their accounts. I think there was a chart in there that showed that Black persons who have accounts are paying more than other persons. And why is that the case? I mean, it can't all be real estate, right? If you're living in an area that isn't necessarily expensive. So making sure that there is equity, and also there's financial literacy. I think there's a lot that banks can do and corporations can do to educate people about the benefits of using traditional banking versus alternative forms of banking. And then finally, digital banking, digital finance is very powerful. Most people have a cell phone. So making sure that, traditional banks have an online presence such that people can use their cell phones and their computers in order to transact business. So all of these are great ideas for helping people to become banked.
Great. Thank you so much. So when you talk about the online banking component, that also presupposes that many urban communities are digitally connected. So, I mean, true, they all have cell phones, but to actually have broadband, I mean, that really also becomes a requirement or a necessity, I would think, for cities to really begin to look at how to connect all sectors of their community. And, especially in light of the pandemic, I mean, that's a great need.
Absolutely. And indeed, one thing we've noticed, and this is a little tangential, but many young people have fallen behind in school because either they don't have a laptop or they have a laptop, but they don't have high-speed internet. And so that extends to their parents who are attempting digital banking. And so, one thing the next administration, U.S. administration, is looking at is investing in broadband and 5G and the general infrastructure to make sure that you don't have this digital divide amongst people within the United States.
Okay, great. And thank you so much, Dana, for your responses, for your insight, for the body of work that you are doing. Very impressive. For those that are attending, you can see that the videos will be available. Dana's presentation will be available at libertybank.com/housing matters. Again, if you can go to liberty-bank.com/housing matters, you can pick up Dana's presentation, and you'll also be able to pick up David Erickson's presentation. So we're still open to take questions. Dana, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for the work that you continue to do. Thank you for coming back to Middletown and being part of the community that helped get you started. And so I'm glad that your counselor was very insightful to allow you to tell you that that's the best school that you should attend. And so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good. So in talking about housing matters and really looking at how we could dismantle these disparities and break the barriers, one of the things that community development wanted to do, Liberty wanted to produce a video that we could actually showcase the relevance and the importance of housing matter, the housing issue, and why it really is so important. And so we created a video that we're about to show you. It's about a 10-minute video, so if you will indulge us for that. But this video really is to talk about the housing needs and, to pretty much give some tools to municipalities, to, state officials, for others who really are looking to see and understand how they can best move into this realm. And not only that, but also the necessity of housing matters. So I'm going to be quiet, and I think our housing video is being queued up. But this is really a tool that we think that would really be good. This will also be on our website to really get out to the practitioners in the marketplace to really galvanize around this whole issue around housing matters.
The reality for the state of Connecticut, for the United States, is that affordable housing should be in both urban, rural, as well as suburban. The need for affordable housing is everywhere. It affects everyone. And so when you look at how can we improve the quality of life, change socioeconomic factors for our families, especially our working families, this approach in terms of affordable housing, it needs to be diverse. It needs to be in the Hartfords, the Bloomfields, the Boltons, the Suffields, the Essexes, Westbrook. It should be throughout the whole entire state. And that's how you truly bring change. That's how you truly create those opportunities. Sometimes some folks say, it's limited. It's only certain families that need it. And my reality is that even working with Habitat, the need is great, and it's everyone, every color, every walk, every faith. Everyone wants, needs, desires to have a simple, affordable home to live in.
We're so grateful to have Habitat. Before applying for the program, we lived in low income, which is like subsidized housing. We was in a 12-unit apartment building on the north end of Hartford, which was, as you know, a nightmare. Having our headboards up to their windows to block the shootings, repeated sirens. We have a 6-year-old daughter now, but at the time, a young toddler, unable to go outside and play, couldn't really enjoy herself. So applying for Habitat was like a great experience for us to be a homeowner. Now we have our own yard, to own our own home, like pretty much a whole different experience.
So Connecticut has some of the most expensive housing in the country. It has some of the most cost-burdened residents in the country. Typically talk about it paying more than 30% of their income for housing. In Connecticut, 50% of renters, half of renters do that. And that's some 200,000+ households that are paying an unsustainable amount of money for their rent, which means they're not able to support their families in an adequate way with the remainder of the money.
So my name is Melissa Kaplan-Macy. I'm Vice President for State Programs and Connecticut Director with the Regional Plan Association. We're a tri-state nonprofit research planning and advocacy organization, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut metropolitan region, and we've been doing work in this space for almost 100 years. In terms of affordable housing and where it's available in Connecticut, we have a lot of affordable housing. In our cities, we don't have as much in our suburbs, and the need is across both of those types of jurisdictions. We need affordable housing everywhere. We need people to be able to afford their homes. And so I think it's really important for us to recognize, as we're working to create more affordable housing in more places in the state, that the unevenness of where affordable housing exists today, and that's not, it's not by accident.
So some of the challenges to expanding the amount of affordable housing in communities, there's a lot of challenges, but a lot of it has to do with really local resistance and what I think is misunderstanding of what affordable housing is. So some of the opposition really begins, I think, with a lack of understanding of what's being proposed. Connecticut, really, local towns have, many have gotten into this place where it's not just affordable housing that folks oppose, it's really any growth at all.
If someone was to ask, is it always a golden path towards where we want to build and opportunities to build? And I would say most cases it is. In most cases, we go into communities and it's the welcome mat is rolled out and it's a smooth process. In some cases, we do have to deal with segregation and stereotypes and the thought that, affordable housing is, for poor people, or it's going to bring in crime, it's going to bring in, or it's going to reduce the quality of life, or it's going to reduce the market value for a neighborhood.
They're not used to seeing new construction and how it can fit well into a community and how it actually can be an improvement over the existing housing. There seems to be almost a knee-jerk reaction against any growth and change, but of course, there's always change because we all age and our housing all ages.
And so we're constantly having to educate and explain that our homeowners are just like every other homeowner. They want to purchase, they want to own, they want to take care of it, they want to make sure that it's pretty on the outside and beautiful on the inside.
It was intentional federal, state, local policies put in place that prohibited people of color from accumulating wealth from buying homes in suburban communities. And so, in the communities that we have in our state today, this very, clear racial segregation and the inability for a lot of people over generations to access homes in the suburbs to accumulate wealth over generations, people have been locked out of that. So the need to create more affordability in the suburbs, it's not so much a lot of the conversation you hear is, I'm happy to have anybody live in my town as long as they can afford it. And that sort of assumes that this is, that there's equity when we know that there is not.
Many people don't realize that the person living next door to you would qualify for affordable housing. The person who serves you dinner qualifies for affordable housing. The person who treats your children, the nurse at your pediatrician's office, qualifies for affordable housing. Your recent college grad, your own child, would qualify for affordable housing. We have to educate oftentimes in the communities that we want to serve. We try to work in communities that we're invited in. Oftentimes we're approached by community leaders to consider doing an affordable housing development. They see the need. They see this corporation that's just moved into their town, but they can't attract the workforce housing folks because that town doesn't have any housing. People can't afford to commute 45 minutes, an hour every day to this industry that this town worked really hard to attract. Living in Connecticut is very expensive. So we come along and we agree to do some affordable housing, whether it's home ownership or rental. And that rental deal will almost always be mixed income. We no longer put people in silos. People live next to each other, they will thrive. An artist living next to a CEO who's choosing to live in an apartment, which happens a lot, they get a lot from each other. They learn a lot from each other. They benefit from each other.
I think that it is no secret that there is a shortage of housing within our nation's borders. And that also holds true for the state of Connecticut. So the department is working hard to create and preserve homes that are affordable for all our families. For me, it's having options that if you as a young adult want to live in the city, you have that option and you can afford it. We have to consider that the importance of balancing investing in our cities as well as investing in our towns.
So I'm Norm Needleman, and I am the first selectman of the town of Essex. I've been serving in this capacity since 2011. I'm also the state senator in the 33rd district. We've had this ongoing thing where people who work here can't live here because it's relatively expensive. It's a community of single-family homes, mostly, as are most of these towns. So we want to provide access to housing for people to live here, work here, shop here. The affordable housing component is one component of that, obviously. Transportation and jobs are the other component. I think as much as we want to focus on affordable housing out into the more rural and suburban areas of the state, which I totally support, we also need to make sure that there's good quality housing in the communities that people grew up in and want to continue to live in. There are two ways to do affordable housing in this state. It can be community-based or it could be private developers. Communities will be more receptive to local people trying to take these things on and deal with these initiatives. So I'm a huge advocate of an organization like Hope Partnership. They are local people. They have banded together because they recognize a need. And they formed a nonprofit, and they have been actively seeking properties, redeveloping properties, building new properties that are affordable housing.
My name is Tony Lyons. I am one of the founders of an organization called Hope Partnership, which is a nonprofit organization that's been in existence in the Connecticut shoreline area since 2004. Hope is, in the 14 years it's been around, it's produced one very successful project called Ferry Crossing, It's about to open a second project in Essex called Spencer's Corner, which will add 17 new affordable units to the local housing stock. So we really are working hard to bring affordable housing options to very expensive, very affluent shoreline communities where there's been a historic lack of affordable housing options. And we've had a lot of success and a lot of support from institutions like United Way, like Liberty Bank, and other financial institutions that are supporting our work.
We really believe here at Liberty Bank that it's really the right for all of Connecticut citizens that they should have a decent and affordable housing to live in. So we are involved in various programs. One in particular is our involvement with the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston. They have an affordable housing project, and annually we support nonprofit organizations in engaging them to provide more affordable rental housing and home ownership opportunities throughout Connecticut.
Hi, my name is Santina, and I'm a resident at Ferry Crossing in Old Saybrook. I've been here about 8 years since they originally were built. One of the benefits that I see with affordable housing is it really enables a lot of people that are already in the community, that are working here, that are in schools here. It gives them the opportunity to live in the community, and which as a result gives them a chance to give back to the community.
I think that along the way I became passionate about housing because I was one of those people that live in a Section 8 subsidized apartment when I had 2 jobs and I was going to school at night. And as a single mom, that helped me and it made a difference in my life. And probably because of that apartment, I'm here today because I was able to go to school and I was able to keep my daughter safe. And it was a place that it was very comfortable and I could pay 30% of my income. So I do know that it makes a difference in somebody's life.
Being an advocate at the local level, that's the most effective way to make change happen in your community, no matter what it is. The folks, if there's a proposal in your town for affordable housing development, the folks that are opposed to that development will come out. If you are supportive of that development, the most effective thing you can do is let your local leaders, local officials know that.
Just taking the time to show up and say, yes, we need this, so that the folks who are making the decisions are hearing, more than one set of voices. It's not just the people who are getting up and saying, please don't put that next door to me. There's voices saying, we really need this in our town and here's why.
They need to know that people in their community support expanding low-cost housing.
Come on. We want you, we need you. Our mission is driven by the support of others. The opportunity to serve is always available.
So I think if there isn't an affordable housing or a housing group in your community, then I think form one. I think that's critical.
To have David back again. He comes with an extensive background from in community development, in the whole space around economic development and economic education. So David, we're excited to hear what you have to say about guardrails and airbags.
Thank you, Glenn, and thanks for having me back again. I was just thinking, I was reflecting back on the time I was with you last year, and I had just moved to New York in September of that year, so a couple months before the event. and I went to sleep, and I looked on Google Maps, like it seemed like from my hotel to the site of the conference was a short walk, and I had timed it, set the alarm and all the rest, and didn't realize that a layer of snow had fallen. And so I had to walk through the State House grounds to get to the site, and ruined my first pair of shoes on the East Coast, on my first year in the East Coast. So that was my introduction there. But it's really a thrill to be back with you. I am representing myself here, and the views I'm sharing are my own, and not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the Federal Reserve System. I would like to say, one of my favorite quotes is from Dwight Eisenhower, who said that when he is confronted with a complicated problem, something that seems like an intractable problem, his first instinct is to make it bigger. Because when you make it bigger, you start to see different patterns and contours of the issue. And I so enjoyed Dana's presentation to talk about the racial wealth gap, because it really is this. It illustrates this kind of model that I've had for quite a while now, which is that the status quo is stupid, unfair, and expensive. And you can see that if we were to pursue policies, as she highlighted, that would increase fairness and better access to capital, that we would add to the entire economy, that we'd all benefit, we would all be better off. And maybe some of you who may have been at the event last year may have remembered what I was speaking about there was a different but related problem, which is that we spend a lot of money on medical care each year in this country, but we don't necessarily get great health outcomes out of it. And the things there's a significant amount of money we spend on things like chronic disease that is avoidable. That if we were to create, better neighborhoods, you think about that Ferry Crossing neighborhood, how beautiful that was, and walking that sidewalk and being connected to the community as that resident described, that's something that promotes health. And so I've been really focused on this other related idea that could we take health dollars to spend on the upstream social determinants of health, like affordable housing, and create sort of more opportunities that way. So you think about the issue of racial wealth disparities, the lack of the declining income or economic mobility in this country. If you think about the fact that you were born in 1940, 90% of those people were earned more than their parents by the end of their life. If you're born in 1980, that number is about 50%. It's about a 50-50 proposition that you'll earn more than your parents. Like the opportunities seem to be declining. And so what I'm trying to do here, and what I'm trying to do in this presentation, and which is reflecting the themes of a book that I'm writing for the Brookings Institution, is can we combine those problems and solve them simultaneously? So that's really the focus of this presentation. So now one of the things I want to just sort of tackle early on is I think there is this perception that if we just spent more money on the problem, we would solve it. Like there's a sense that the United States has no real welfare state policies, that our anti-poverty programs are starved for resources, and there was a book called The American Healthcare Paradox, came out in 2013, and this is one of their famous charts. The authors have put this chart in many op-eds and other. I'm sure many of you have seen it before, but these are basically sort of the wealthy nations and what they spend on medical care, which is in those in these bars, and you see the countries, or each country is a column, and in the dark color, what each country spends on medical care. And then what you see in the light gray column are what those countries spend on social welfare, or what many refer to as the social determinants of health: housing, education, and the other sort of transportation and the other sort of services that help build community. And you see in a place like Sweden, which is on the far left side, that they spend a small amount of on medical care relative to their social expenditures, and as a nation have better health outcomes than we do. And they looked at sort of how we are something of an outlier in this comparison, where the United States spends much more on medical care than any other country, and yet and significantly less than those other countries on the social determinants of health. But one of the problems with that is that this chart kind of gives you the impression that we don't spend that much on social welfare. But if we were to go to the next chart, you'll see a different comparison, which is, now this is one of the things that people often don't realize is that the social programs in the United States are often funded through the tax code. So that's different than direct expenditures. That's different than you tax a dollar, you spend a dollar. That's direct expenditures. But there are a bunch of programs like the Affordable Housing Program. The number one driver of affordable housing, as many of you know, is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. That does not show up in the budget. That is part of the Internal Revenue Code. And so it's a dollar not collected, but is tied to a social outcome like affordable housing, and we get that sort of social welfare outcome from it. And so the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, does an analysis of the wealthy nations around the world each year of what they spend on social welfare, both in direct expenditures and tax expenditures. And if you see, and this graph is a little bit hard to follow, I apologize, but you really, what I really want to draw your attention to is the red diamond that you see on there. And the red diamond is basically the summation of those two sources of funding for social welfare. And you'll see that the United States, rather than being in the middle of the pack, is really close to the leader of the pack in terms of spending on social welfare. There is only one country in the world that spends more on social welfare than the United States, and that's France. So we go to the next slide, you'll see there's another layer on top of this. So the point I'm trying to make here is that going back to my problem statement that the status quo is stupid, unfair, and expensive, and then if we could sort of think about how we can sort of combine sort of the issues around economic, the lack of economic mobility, the lack of racial equity in terms of our wealth and income, and the fact that we have skyrocketing healthcare costs that can only be controlled by spending on the upstream social determinants of health. The point I'm trying to make here is that we have the resources to commit to sort of tackling both problems. It is not a problem. It is not a lack of resources. It's a lack of imagination. And if I were to sort of take this another level, if we were to think about we spend a lot of money on the downstream consequences of not making those upstream investments in the first place. If we had more ferry crossing neighborhoods, we would have lower expenses in other areas like chronic disease, like lost worker productivity, like the expenses we have in the criminal justice system. We spend a lot of money on special education, particularly on children who arrive at kindergarten not ready to learn, not because they have some cognitive disability, but because they were not given the early childhood enrichment that some middle class and upper class children are privy to. So here is a situation where not only do we spend a lot of money already on social welfare ideas, but programs rather, but we spend a lot of money on the downstream consequences of not getting that upstream investment right. So to me, there just seems to be a tremendous amount of resources to pay for upstream interventions. And if I go to the next slide, so what would that look like? What are we talking about here? And one of the things about improving health that so drew me to it is that I had always been in sort of economic development, community development, thinking about ways in which we could make markets sort of create better social outcomes. I never really thought about the health component to it. But when you get down to it, when they do analysis of like what were the causes of premature death, for example, so often, I mean, you would think that before I got steeped in this, I thought that was sort of either you got bad medical care or you had lack of access to medical care. Well, it turns out that explains a very small percentage of the people who die before they should have died, the premature deaths in this country. So often it is much more around these sort of social determinants of health that you sort of social isolation, lack of ability to sort of lead healthier lives because it was hard to sort of commit to a healthy diet because you lived in a food desert, or hard to commit to sort of regular exercise, as that one young family mentioned that when they lived in Hartford, not allowing their daughter to play outside, right? The parks and playgrounds and things like that. Those are the things that contribute to sort of better health and avoid these premature deaths. And so I was really struck by this quote from Nancy Krieger, a public health official at Harvard, who said, "Your body is the sum record of your challenges and opportunities." And so really, if you think of the things that create opportunities and reduce challenges, it's good schools, it's grocery stores with affordable, fresh food that you can feed your family with, it's high quality, affordable housing in the places where you live and work, it's a job that pays a living wage, it's transportation to connect you to jobs and other resources, it's the opportunity that you have to sort of engage in recreation and exercise that just keeps your body healthy. We can go to the next slide. And we know that these opportunities so we know opportunities and challenges, they are distributed over space, and they land in neighborhoods. And so this is an example of life expectancy by freeway off-ramp in the city of New Orleans. I could do this same there's graphic for Hartford or New York City, where you would see wild disparities in life expectancy in very close proximity. So here in the suburb of Navarre, you've got a life expectancy of 80 years. That's among the highest, longest lived countries in the world, Japan and Iceland. And then in the French Quarter, you see a life expectancy of 55. That's the kind of life expectancy you expect to see in a war-torn nation suffering from deep, deep poverty. And so to have those two realities so close in proximity is a national disgrace. But it's also, I think, a call to action that we can't, if the resources are available to make it happen in one neighborhood, we can make it happen in another. We can go to the next slide. All of this is to sort of to sum a phrase that many of you, I think, are familiar with, which was made famous by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, where they talk about that your zip code is more important than your genetic code for your health. I mean, you think about all the times you fill out all those forms about, what was the history of your parents in terms of their, heart cancer, this and that. That is insignificant compared to your zip code, which just seems crazy to me. Next slide, please. So I'm trying to think about ways in which we can how do we conceptualize an upstream strategy? How do we take those dollars that we know we have, coordinate them in a way that really delivers the things that we know can improve health, the things that can reduce the challenges in a neighborhood and increase the opportunities? And to me, it's this sort of wheel. And these are things that I've been calling guardrails. And I think about, the things that are really essential to sort of creating health in a neighborhood. And you see at the very top, I have affordable housing. And affordable housing is linked in a lot of ways to these other things. Reading at grade level is the #1 predictor of future health for a child in elementary school. One of the leading predictors of reading at grade level is finishing the school year in the school that you started. That's related to a housing issue. When you have a lot of mobility within a churn within a neighborhood and you're going from school to school, it's very hard for that child to stay on target and keep reading at grade level and keep that keep their education at foremost. You saw that woman in the video explaining how her role when she was working 2 jobs and had a young daughter, single mom in public housing. It was a safe, comfortable place, as she described it, and she could keep her kid in the same school where that kid could thrive, right? So education is really critical to future health. We've talked about consistent employment at a living wage, supportive housing. We talked about healthy food in food deserts, the ability to exercise with parks and community space, smart public safety strategies like community policing, reliable public transportation that gets you to the opportunities you need. Medical care is important when you need it. We want to make sure, we want to keep people out of the doctor's office as much as we can, but when you need it, you need access to it. And the other social services that combine all of these things together. These are the things that are sort of, I call them guardrails because I feel as though these are the things that we all enjoy that sort of that help us keep in middle and upper middle class and resource neighborhoods, keep us kind of on the straight and narrow, that the things go sideways, that you have access to these things that help you sort of stay in a place that's healthy. But there's another concept that I've been working on, which I've been calling airbags, which is really, and I'll go to the next slide to discuss that. This is really a concept. I'm stealing this term. This is not mine. It's from Robert Putnam, a professor at Harvard, who wrote a book called Our Kids, and he has in that book a series of these graphs that he calls scissor graphs, where he shows that resource children doing much better over time on a number of different outcomes, as opposed to children who are less resourced. And here it's those at the 90th percentile of income versus those at the 10th percent of income. And what he shows, and there's literally 50 of these graphs in the book. I'm just picking this one on parental enrichment spending on children. But you see a growing increase of spending on kids with resources and fewer resources being spent on kids without them, without family wealth. And one of the things that is really important when we think about an airbag is it deploys when you need it, right? So I think, for example, if you have a drug overdose as a high school student and you're rushed to the hospital, an airbag would be drug rehab program. Or similarly, if you were struggling with depression, an airbag might be psychological counseling and some kind of group therapy. These are the things that happen, in the time when you need it, with the intensity that you need it. And so to me, these things work together. So you have a community that by its nature has sort of all of these safety features built into it, and that you also have the ability to sort of deploy these airbags in the time you need them in order to sort of avoid the obstacles that are inevitable in everyone's life. And so to me, all children deserve guardrails and airbags. And we have the resources to pay for them. And what we're struggling with now is how do you create the business model to make it work? How do you knit all of these things together? I mean, you saw in that video how just building affordable housing requires a local nonprofit and a local public official that's committed to it, and residents who are willing to sort of fight for affordable housing in their community. That takes there are a lot of moving parts to that, and it's really complicated. Guardrails and airbags for everybody, that's even more complicated. And if you go to the next slide, that brings me to Hawaii. So it sounds like you guys are having a little bit of a Hawaii day there in Connecticut today. So I hope that, and Hawaii is a lovely place. If you've ever been, it's really beautiful. It was formerly a plantation economy. A lot of low-income people were brought to work in the fields there, in the pineapple, sugar cane. That's brutal work. And they were relatively low income, relatively low educational outcomes. The state of Hawaii has worse than the national average health outcomes, lower poverty rate, but worse than national outcome in terms of health. Now, what's interesting about Hawaii is one, it's an island. That's kind of interesting. So there's not as much churn. So people kind of stay put a little bit. And there are only 2 health insurance companies in the state of Hawaii, basically. So that in a place like Maui, for example, which is kind of what I've been really focused a lot on, Kaiser Permanente owns about 80% of the downstream medical care cost risk. So this is where my thinking is going. Find places where somebody owns the medical care cost risk in something concentrated way, like Maui, and you've got a very good partner who would be willing to start spending money upstream on guardrails and airbags. And in fact, when Kaiser, through some acquisitions, took over all the hospitals on the island of Maui, they realized that they owned all of this medical care cost risk, and they started talking to preschools because they know arriving at kindergarten is one of the best predictors of future health, one of these great, strong social determinants of health. And that is where they got into the mindset that we needed to invest upstream. And I think there are little Mauis all over the place. There are rural counties in Connecticut where there's one health insurer. And so for those of you doing affordable housing, I would encourage you to reach out to those organizations, reach out to that insurer and say, can we work together to sort of work on building affordable housing, building the communities that promote health, funding the social services that can create those airbags for vulnerable kids in vulnerable times. If we can go to the next slide. Now that William Gibson is a scientific writer, he coined the term cyberspace. He's interesting character, but he has this one quote that I love, which is that the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. So even though it sounds like this guardrails and airbags, that sounds super esoteric. How's that ever going to work? Hawaii is far from Connecticut. Does any of this make sense? What I'm going to go through a series of slides here in the next few minutes, and I'm going to try to just show you that there are aspects of guardrail and airbag implementation that are happening all over the country, and they're using a combination of health and community development finance dollars and other social service dollars and other impact investing dollars to make that happen. And the first one I'm focusing on here is the Conway Center in Washington, D.C. This is affordable housing built on top of a clinic. It was funded through something called the Healthy Futures Fund, which is a fund that is a joint venture between Morgan Stanley, the investment bank, and the local Initiative Support Corporation, a community development financial institution or a nonprofit bank. It's subsidized with some financing with some dollars from the Kresge Foundation, and that subsidy requires that the banks, that those who take out this below market rate financing embrace this concept that the clinic adopts the whole neighborhood as the patient. The clinic is really engaged in guardrail type activity for the whole neighborhood. So in this instance, there's about 200 apartments. Half of them are for people who were formerly homeless. Half of them are for families. The brick area you see below is the clinic. The clinic runs some very targeted training programs for the residents of the housing in healthcare and medical care. This is a location where they're just across the street from a metro stop. So the people who are living in this community have access to the other opportunities available to them in the greater Washington, D.C. metro area. But this is an example where we're focusing on housing, jobs, and medical care as a way to improve the sort of life chances to sort of build in the guardrails and the airbags for this community here. Next slide, please. This is an example in Toledo, Ohio, again with LISP, where they've created a fund where they co-manage, the hospital and Community Reinvestment Act oriented banks through LISP are co-investing in the Toledo area on the upstream social determinants of health. They've set as a priority in this fund to start on food access. And so that's an example, again, of how these two forces can combine and sort of work on some of these upstream social determinants of health. Next slide, please. Here's another example. This is the Healthy Neighborhood Equity Fund. One of the founders of this is my friend Maggie Superchurch, and she was really motivated by this very simple idea. She said, why can I buy stock in a company that invests, that can create a pill that lowers blood pressure, but I can't invest in a neighborhood that does exactly the same thing, that clinically does exactly the same thing. So she created this Healthy Neighborhood Equity Fund. It's an equity fund, which is interesting. These other examples I've been suggesting are loan funds. And debt moves a little bit slower than equity. So this is an effort to try to grab up parcels in the Boston area where they're expanding the public transportation system, and trying to create affordable housing in places that they think will experience gentrification and displacement pressure. Next slide, please. Here's an example of Dignity Health, a hospital system investing with a local CDFI into arts and culture. Again, another way to build community, another way to sort of create, make ties, create excitement and hope in children. And that is absolutely a predictor of future health. Next slide, please. Here's an example: Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. There was a site of a former elementary school in a tough neighborhood near the hospital campus. The hospital partnered with Community Development for All People, a local community development corporation in Columbus, and here they're focusing on all social determinants of health. This is a full guardrail and airbag intervention. And there's a great article in Pediatrics where they've done some comparisons with similar neighborhoods in the Columbus area that didn't receive this level of investment. And they did find a reduced amount of use of the emergency department and some serious cost savings to nationwide children. Last slide. And this last slide just shows that this is an example where United Healthcare is investing directly with Chicanos por la Causa in Phoenix into affordable housing. This has no other subsidy programs in it whatsoever. It's funded entirely by the cost savings that the health insurer, United Healthcare, like a Fortune 10 company, huge company, is reaping from acquisition and rehab of sort of B quality apartment buildings. And what they do is they house many of their Medicaid patients and in this housing, and they find that the better case management of those patients more than offsets the cost of acquiring and rehabbing these apartment buildings that are really beautiful and give those people some real dignity after they've experiencing the trauma of living on the street. So I appreciate you guys. This is an outgrowth of my talks with you last year. I'm taking it I'm trying to take it up a level. It's really, it'll be in the book. I should say, by the way, that I don't receive any proceeds from the sale of the book. If it is for sale next year, but I waived all of that because it's just trying to get the message out. So thank you to Liberty Bank for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. I hope we have time for a question or two.
So, David, in the video, there was a call to action for what individuals can do. What would you tell a community member what they could actually do to create change?
Yeah, I think as Oscar Wilde said, you can't be anything you didn't pretend to be first. There's this active imagination. I think David Glidden got us on this from the very, very beginning, that the 1 + 1 = 3. Like, let's make sure every kid arrives at kindergarten ready to learn. That requires that every neighborhood has guardrails and airbags. Every neighborhood has affordable housing. If we can get people to buy into that image, we can be a radically more fair community, society, more prosperous economy. I think getting people bought into that future is part of the first step.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. And David, I'd like to also go back to another question, but this really has to do with your conversation about tax credits. So would you actually advocate, or are you advocating for a tax credit structure to fund upstream innovations that you spoke about?
So my fantasy, I mean, this is where I kind of geek out a little bit because I did do affordable housing in my early days, but like, what if there was an IRS form 8609 for ready to learn at kindergarten? Like, that to me is the game changer. You know, that would sort of, 8609 is the form that qualifies low-income housing tax credit project for occupancy and allows the tax credits to then flow. I think using the tax code for something to create a quasi-market for some of these outcomes is a powerful tool.
Okay, excellent. And then, David, kind of in the same line of, the kind of tax credit structure, but what one or two policies, and maybe this is one that you think is key, but what one or two policies do you think really need to be amended or changed at the federal level that would really have an immediate impact to improve housing opportunities, but ultimately have the trickle-down effect to improving the other social determinants?
One of the things I would really focus on, I think community development finance has shown the way that if you create a quasi-market, that actors, whether they're for-profit, nonprofit, community activists, others can form together into coalitions to really create a better outcome. I mean, the ferry crossing, I keep on mentioning that, but like, how clearly beautiful is that? And that's an example where private-public partnerships with community input created that. I think if we were to switch much of our social service dollars around to outcomes-based financing, so don't pay for homeless shelter slots, pay for somebody getting off the streets permanently. Don't pay for hours of tutoring, pay for each student who is vulnerable to graduate from high school, however you get there. If we were to switch some of those, the nearly $1 trillion we spend on social welfare, to focus it on outcomes-based financing, together with some of these sort of quasi-market tools like the low-income housing tax credit and others, I think you'd have a powerful funding source and create the incentives for some of these upstream social determinants of health interventions.
And then finally, and knowing our time, but it says, so how would you make, in reference to what you're really talking about, how would you make these, the guardrail, airbag argument of interesting to or palatable to both sides of the aisle?
I've been thinking a lot about that, and part of the reason why I'm focusing really on kids is that I think that sort of partisanship just melts away when you talk about children. I think we all can agree every kid deserves to have a good start in life. Every kid deserves to arrive at kindergarten with the tools they need to thrive. And it's just not only is it fair, it's less expensive, and they're going to be big, they're going to contribute more to society. So I think there's lots of ways to make this argument for almost all types of people along the political spectrum.
Okay, thank you. Matt, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And we'll turn to David Glidden for any closing thoughts and comments. So, David, we've opened up your line there. Anything you want to share before we wrap up with our audience today?
Again, a big thank you to Glenn and Pam, my Liberty Bank teammates, and the others for helping us kind of coordinate this. But big thanks to Dana and David. Again, thank you for joining us on this very, very important topic. And lastly, and mostly importantly, thanks to everybody for taking time to participate on this. And great conversation, great ideas, great North Star that we need to start looking for, and let's turn this into actionable items that we can all take away from here. So thank you, and everybody have a terrific Friday and a great weekend. Liberty's pleased to play this role. Thank you.